For this week's lesson, we will be picking up where we left off. Last week we considered Genesis chapter 42. This week, Genesis chapter 43. And Joseph's poor brothers, they continue to have it piled on to them through Joseph's tests and also through the demands of their father, as we will see. So let's dive right in. Genesis chapter 43. It reads, "Now the famine was severe in the land, and when they had eaten up the grain they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, 'Go again, buy us a little more food.' But Judah said to him, 'The man solemnly warned us, saying, You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you will send our brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down. For the man said to us, You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you.'" Perhaps I should have said last week that a trip to and from Egypt, from where Jacob's family resided in Canaan, takes about 2 weeks round trip. So we can estimate how long poor old Simeon has been incarcerated by something that Judah says a bit later in verse chapter 10, whilst trying to persuade his father to let them go back to Egypt with Benjamin in tow. He says, "If we had not delayed, we would have returned twice." So given 2 weeks per round trip, it would have taken, we may surmise, given the 2 weeks round trip that it would have taken, we can guess that Simeon has been jailed for about a month. As an aside, I, Heath Jones, personally find it frustrating that Jacob is prompted to return to Egypt because they've run out of food and not because his son Simeon remains incarcerated. And this is a fact that he has apparently resigned himself to. He chalks Simeon up to as a lost cause. And back in Genesis chapter 42, verse 36, we read last week, him saying to his sons, "I am the one you have bereaved of children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And now you would take Benjamin." As we'll soon find out in the chapters that follow, Simeon is very much not no more. But Simeon's life is not what drives the decisions that Jacob / Israel in this chapter. Jacob's called Israel throughout this chapter. Simeon's life is not what drives his decision. The text goes on, verse 6. "Israel said, 'Why did you treat me so badly as to tell the man that you had another brother?' They replied, 'The man questioned us carefully about ourselves and our kindred, saying, Is your father still alive? Have you another brother?' What we told him was an answer to these questions. Could we in any way know that he would say, 'Bring your brother down'? Then Judah said to his father Israel, 'Send the boy with me, and let us be on our way, so that we may live and not die. You and we, and also our little ones. I myself will be surety for him. You can hold me accountable for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. If we had not delayed, we would have returned twice." I continue to not like Jacob's behavior in this story. "Why did you treat me so badly?" he says. "Why did you treat me so badly as to tell the man that you had a brother?" Reminder, his children have been pulling all the way, slogging it to Egypt to get food. There, they were threatened to the point of death with accusations of spying, the death penalty being the consequence of spying. And then the money that they had used to procure the food was returned to their sacks whilst they were unawares. So now they fear accusations of thievery. For all these reasons, Jacob's children should be hesitant to go back, and they most certainly were. Not to mention, again, I repeat, Simeon is in jail, presumably, if you listen to his father, left to rot. But Jacob cannot help but make it about his own grievances even now, as he did back at the end of chapter 42. But the brothers were willing to go, but only if they can bring Benjamin per Joseph's request. Was their willingness to return to Egypt motivated by the need to procure food or to rescue Simeon? I think that verse 10 indicates the latter. Judah lamenting the fact that they should not have delayed and they could have made 2 trips in the meantime. Though I also think that both reasons to go are probably likely, that they also knew that they needed to procure food. And it was both reasons that Judah gave as he attempted to persuade his father. So to Israel's objections, Judah mounts a defense. Judah proceeds with what proves to be a highly persuasive speech. He pleads with Israel to let Benjamin return with them, claiming this to be a life and death matter for the family, even the children. Jacob had not heard the matter put in such terms by the brothers before. Then Judah, in a way more laudable and magnanimous than Reuben, pause to remind you, Reuben had basically offered his children as collateral if they should not be able to return Benjamin. Judah puts his own life on the line. So in a way more laudable and magnanimous than Reuben, although I will say that what Reuben offered was also, I think, magnanimous and laudable. Well, Judah places himself on the line as the personal guarantor of Benjamin's safety. Finally, Judah notes the delay in returning, indirectly pointing to Jacob's own refusal to send Benjamin. That's a prolonged quote from Fritham from the New Interpreter Bible Commentary. Verse 11. Then their father Israel said to them, if it must be so, then do this. Take some of the choice fruits of the land in your bags and carry them down as a present to the man, a little balm and a little honey, gum, resin, pistachio nuts, and almonds. Take double the money with you. Carry back with you the money that was returned in the top of your sacks. Perhaps it was an oversight. Take your brother also, and be on your way again to the man. May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, so that he may send back your other brother and Benjamin. As for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. So the men took the present, and they took double the money with them, as well as Benjamin. Then they went on their way down to Egypt and stood before Joseph. So Judah argues persuasively, and Jacob can see no way out of his conundrum. His options seem to be as follows. 1, keep Benjamin home and starve. Or 2, send Benjamin with his other sons to Egypt and maybe live. Even given Jacob's primary motive to protect Benjamin at all costs at the expense of his other brothers, Jacob's decision is sensible. He really has no choice. So he gives his approval for the plan. Hybert writes, he then decides to go all in and to try to ensure the plan is successful. He sends his sons with various gifts. Ironically, they are sent with many of the same gifts that the traders carried that Joseph's brothers sold him to. They are also given the money that had been meant for payment on the previous journey to return, along with more money for this journey's purchase. The gift is intended to gain Jacob's favor. It's similar to the gift offered by Jacob and Esau. Verse 16. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, bring the men into the house and slaughter an animal and make ready, for the men are to dine with me at noon. The man did as Joseph said and brought the men to Joseph's house. Now the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house, and they said, it is because of the money replaced in our sacks the first time that we have been brought in, so that he may have an opportunity to fall upon us and make slaves of us and take our donkeys. Fritham writes, because of the possible charge of theft on account of the returned money, the brothers were afraid. Their fear is unfounded this time, but anticipates the next time when Benjamin will be implicated. Joseph is playing on their fears as part of the test. Salhammer writes, the reader, however, is assured at the outset that the brothers are being taken into the house for a great feast. So we're in the know. The brothers are not in the know. We know that the brothers' fears are misguided. All of this would serve to disorient Joseph's brothers. They would certainly not expect a sumptuous feast, the one that is in store for them. And I just wrote here principal's office because I was reminded of times when I was called down to the principal's office and I did not know what it was for. And so I would sit in the seat with anxiety about whether or not I had done something to get in trouble. And sometimes that was the case. But then I do remember one time where I discovered that my mother was picking me up early for some appointment that I had to keep, and it was like fresh air. It was wonderful news, and so you never know. In this case, the brothers will discover that they are in for a real treat, at least initially. But they take their fears and their anxieties to the steward of Joseph's house. And verse 19 reads, so they went up to the steward of Joseph's house and spoke with him at the entrance to the house. They said, Oh, my lord, we came down the first time to buy food. And when we came to the lodging place, we opened our sacks, and there was each one's money in the top of his sack, our money in full weight. So we have brought it back with us. Moreover, we have brought down with us additional money to buy food. We do not know who put our money in our sacks. He replied, Rest assured, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father must have put treasure in your sacks for you. I received your money. Then he brought Simeon out to them. When the steward had brought the men into Joseph's house and given them water, and they had washed their feet, and when he had given their donkeys fodder, they made the present ready for Joseph's coming at noon, for they had heard that they would dine there. That's sort of funny that the steward would say, no, it was not I who put the money in your sacks. We do not know, when in fact probably it was the steward who had done so. And notice that the steward reframes what happened in theological terms, bringing God into the picture. Freitham writes, the steward responds graciously, even though he keeps them off balance by the way he talks about the money and God. He assures them that everything is in order. Literally, shalom be with you. When he says, rest assured, do not be afraid, it's the phrase shalom be with you, the peace of God be with you. So they need not be afraid. He tells them that God must have put the treasure in their sacks. And his statement about receiving their money renounces any claim to it. In other words, he says, you have paid your debt in full. And they actually had before the money was put back in the sack. But he is not speaking only a half-truth. He's not feigning ignorance about the money. He seems to indicate that he knows the money that they're talking about, but instead he puts it into theological terms. What I mean by that, or what Freitham means by that is this, as far as I can tell. While it is true that the steward did initially receive payment for the last journey's supply of food, the claim that God put the money in Joseph's brothers' sacks seems dishonest from the vantage point of the steward, who very likely put the money in the sacks himself. However, in ascribing these actions to God, the steward frames all of these events in theological terms, implying that even through the actions of Joseph and his steward, God is working things out. True, the steward is the one who quite literally placed the money in the sacks, but all of these events are being directed and inspired by God's guiding hand. So perhaps that's why the steward reframes things in theological terms. Verse 26. When Joseph came home, they brought him the present that they had carried into the house and bowed to the ground before him. He inquired about their welfare and said, Is your father well? The old man of whom you spoke, is he still alive? They said, Your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive. And they bowed their heads and did obeisance. Freitham writes that this marks an important transition in the narrative, at least from Joseph's perspective. The relationship between the brothers has shifted toward the positive. So these verses really mark a turning point in Joseph's relationship with his brothers. So although the brothers seem to have passed the test, now the focus turns to their father, Jacob. Joseph inquires at this point as to whether their father is still alive. And I wonder, this is my own musing, I wonder if Joseph might have confessed at this meal his true identity to his brothers if Jacob had been dead. End of story. However, Jacob is alive, and it appears that there must be a reckoning. Perhaps Joseph has in mind the resentment his brothers had previously felt as a result of their father's favoritism. Maybe Joseph wanted to discover if this long-standing rift persisted. Perhaps Joseph is interested in creating more opportunities for the brothers to reveal their faithfulness to and care for their father in spite of his favoritism. We'll have more on this next week, but either way, for now, Joseph does not tip his hand. Verse 29. Then he looked up and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son. With that, Joseph hurried out because he was overcome with affection for his brother, and he was about to weep. So he went to a private room and wept there. Handel writes, the dramatic sight of Benjamin, pointedly referred to as his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, causes Joseph to be overcome with affection. Verse 30. A rare direct description of inner emotions. Joseph, the trickster, almost loses his disguise, but he manages to control himself. And that's what Handel writes. I wonder how the brothers felt as Joseph exits the room quickly and without explanation. I'm not sure that I would call that managing to control oneself, but he doesn't. He manages to keep up the ruse and to not reveal his true identity. Now, true, Joseph did weep as a result of his interacting with his half brothers in the last chapter, in verse 24 of chapter 42. So we may surmise that he does love all of his siblings, but the fact that he breaks down and weeps at the sight of his full brother Benjamin alludes to a special bond. The text referring to him as Joseph's, mother's son, emphasizes this point. Verse 31. Then he washed his face and came out. He must have had a real good cry. He had to wash his face, comes out, controlling himself. He said, serve the meal. They served him by himself and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with them by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. When they were seated before him, the firstborn according to his birthright and the youngest according to his youth, the men looked at one another in amazement. Portions were taken to them from Joseph's table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. So they drank and were merry with him. Fritham writes, at the meal, Joseph eats separately from his brothers and the Egyptians, signifying his liminal status between identities. Disguised from his kin, he is a Hebrew who rules over Egyptians, but one with whom the Egyptians cannot eat. Fritham writes, separate servings are given to Joseph, to the brothers, and to the Egyptians because of religious scruples. Joseph sits between communities. This would have to be an odd scene where these 3 groups are presumably in the same room, but each eating at separate tables. And it strikes me as pretty silly. But that was the way things were in Egypt at that time. And true to previous week's lessons, I included a Lego picture. Again, I could do only Lego pictures because somebody took the time to enact most every scene in the book of Genesis with Legos. I'm not going to do that, but there you have it. Handel writes, the brothers' astonishment at the correct seating order from firstborn to youngest shows again the crossed perspectives. Joseph is knowledgeable and the brothers deceived. Joseph is again toying with them. The youngest has the most lavish portion, recalling Joseph's previous status within the family, which might kindle the jealousy of the older brothers. But the brothers drank and were merry with no hint of resentment. And that is still further evidence that the brothers have grown up and have allowed the resentment to fall by the wayside. So as we see, the brothers continue to sail through these tests, and here they show themselves to be fully recovered from their tendency to be jealous of the favoritism shown to the child or the children of Rachel. But alas, their trials and tribulations are not yet over. In the next chapter, Joseph will yet again turn up the heat. Some closing thoughts. Family dynamics are complicated in any age. The experiences that shape families, for good or for ill, create entrenched patterns of relating. Sometimes these patterns are destructive to the individuals in the family. Other times, family members learn from mistakes made in the past and grow in wisdom. It seems clear that Joseph's brothers have done precisely this. The men that we met back in chapter 37 were blinded by jealousy and resentment. The brothers we meet in these chapters place their father's well-being and the well-being of one another at the forefront. The transformation is truly remarkable, rare, and a gift from God. And as I reflect on that point, I think of the rifts in some of my own family circles, and makes me desire all the more for some movement of God's Spirit to mend the divide, to for us all to gain in wisdom. And no doubt you can think of relationships within your family that have been damaged or strained. These men were at first the sort of persons who would sell their brother into slavery, all save Reuben. But now they are the sort of men who are not content to leave any one brother behind, even to save themselves. One persistent theme in Genesis has been that God is always at work behind the scenes, leading Abraham's children to peace and plenty, health and wholeness. The story of Joseph and his brothers certainly testifies to this. This story gives us hope, or may give us hope, for change and reconciliation in our own families by the grace of God. And it just leaves me pining for that all the more as I consider the different tensions that me and my family sometimes do grapple with. Next week, we will be covering Genesis chapter 44 in its entirety, and then through verse 15 of chapter 45. Chapter 44 ends on more than a cliffhanger. It seems to end, well, yeah, it ends on a cliffhanger. And so I thought it best for us to lump the next 15 verses into next week's lesson. And I think we'll see why next week. And so Genesis chapter 44 through chapter 45, verse 15. Here are my sources cited. And ask that you unmute yourselves for comments or further reflections.
I thought it was interesting. I was trying to find the scripture so I could look exactly what they were. But when they finally decided to go back, and they took gifts with them.
Yeah.
And it seems like somehow they had food to eat. But
that thought occurred to me too.
But it wasn't apparently the food they wanted. And the fact that they could still live for a month. There it is. It's in it's a verse 11.
Yeah.
A little balm, a little honey, spices, pistachio nuts, almonds. It may have not have been a perfect diet, but I guess maybe that's what they sustained themselves on the month that they didn't go.
Yeah, or maybe they had enough grain, they had enough grain to make bread and other things. I mean, it's not grain, which is probably more substantial.
I'm thinking they're going after the grain because we know that that's what Joseph put in storage was grain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have two thoughts. The first is perhaps we are meant to think that those items wouldn't have been as readily available in Egypt, although I do think that they had those things, especially being along the Nile, but maybe they were more delicacies and less something that you would sustain on your family would live on, long term. So maybe it's more the gesture than I don't know. But the second thing that is interesting is that many of the things that they bring to Joseph in Egypt were the same spices and goods that those that they sold him to were carrying.
Yes.
And so there's an irony there. And this story is filled with those parallels. These parallels where there's this, and that's a lot of fun. I think that's for us to enjoy those details. And little do they know, the ones that sold Joseph for those things, or to people carrying those things. Now they are bringing those things back to Joseph, but they don't know it. But I thought the same thing. They seem to have food.
As many times as I've heard and read this story, I really didn't get the fact that they couldn't eat together, I guess, before. Kind of history repeats itself. There's certain classes can do such and such, and we still have it today. That part hasn't seemed to change.
Yeah, but if you remember, when they do go down there to live, they have to go to Goshen because they're shepherds, because they can't be around they detest for the shepherds.
Again, it's another kind of a class thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So just on that same note, Janet, what does it mean that they were served? Maybe I'm not reading this right. Let me find it. Portions were taken to them from Joseph's table. Does that mean anything or signify anything?
I would think that Joseph, being the second most powerful person in Egypt, feeding anyone from his table signifies that he is bestowing a great blessing on them.
So he's not like breaking a taboo or showing extra generosity because he's sharing his food.
I only know as much about that as this verse
Okay.
gives us.
But
I
don't you think that the being number 2 in the country, his table was a lot better than most people's table? And so to me, that says that they were not getting the food from the people that were out in the fields, but they were getting the best food available.
Yeah. And also what Joseph knows, and what maybe apparently the Egyptians know that Joseph is not an Egyptian, and they probably know he's a Hebrew, so that's why they have him at a separate table. And and so Joseph really isn't breaking a taboo. As a matter of fact, and I hadn't thought about it this way, but perhaps it's meant to be a kind of a clue to the clueless brothers that they are eating with a kinsperson. Maybe that's what we're meant to take from it. That's just something that occurred to me off the top of my head right now.
But he already has an Egyptian wife. I mean, he's pretty much a similar, I mean, he's the second lord of Egypt, so he's more or less an Egyptian. I don't know. It's very confusing.
And Joseph itself is an Egyptian, is derivative of an Egyptian name too. There was a pharaoh Djoser built one of the first step pyramids. Actually, I think he built the first step pyramid, which is now just a heap of ruins because it was very poorly constructed and was never used when they were trying to learn how to make pyramids. But Djoser, very linguistically very similar to Joseph. And there's other clues too, like in later in Exodus, well, Moses, which just comes from the same. It says that it's, in Hebrew means from the reeds, but also it's the same as Ramoses, as in Ramses. You know. So there are those clues that he is assimilated. I don't know what much to make of this little, just sort of almost seems like a throwaway verse where it makes a point of pointing out that they are separated from one another, 3 separate tables. Again, I'm unaware of this custom except for this one verse. I haven't encountered it anywhere else.
And not much is said, at least here at the end, that Benjamin's portion was 5 times more. Here he's the youngest child, and do we have anything to figure out at what age Benjamin would have been at this time?
That sounds like a Sue Osborne question.
Well, it seems to me like he's like 8 to 10 years younger than Joseph. And at one time, Joseph, he was 17 when he went. I think he was 30 when he was put in charge.
Yeah, that's right.
And the 7 years of the famine have the good years are gone and they're in the bad, so that makes him 37
plus.
And maybe another year or two. We'll just say 40 for round up, and so that would make him around 30, maybe 25 to 30, in that range.
Okay,
that's my guess.
Well done, thank you.
So he, I guess, having 5 times more than the rest of them wouldn't have been too out of place.
He could probably pack it away somewhere. Yeah. I love the things that you all noticed that I didn't even give a thought about. This has happened several times.
Well, another thing, where he says, go out and slaughter the animal and then we're going to have lunch, that that kind of was repeated way back when we studied that earlier. Yes.
Yeah. And Abraham and the angels and Jesus.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you notice the same detail. I love, these are things that I hardly even considered. That's good.
But you still think that older brothers might have thought, well, why is he getting 5 times more than we're getting? I mean, that's just human nature.
Well, then the commentator made a point of emphasizing the last verse, which is, so they drank together and were merry, right after he gets that. So like the brothers who sold Joseph into slavery were the ones that when Joseph was favored, given a unique garment or coat to set him apart, they sold him. Now these are the sorts of men that, even though the youngest brother of the second wife, the secondary wife, even though he is even in Egypt receiving, for reasons they don't understand or know, receiving 5 times what they received, they're still able to dine and have a good time. So I think that is another test and another hurdle that they cross, and they show themselves to be
More
people
mature.
who have, grown in wisdom. Yeah, more mature.
My translation says, and so they feasted and drank freely with him.
This one says, so they drank together and were at ease. And the NRSV says they, what I said, they drank together and were merry. But the point is, they got along amicably for the time being, till next chapter, where Joseph stirs it up again.
Can't you just see him loving this?
Yeah. Now I'm going to make the case, and I'm not going to make it perfectly because I think it's an open question, but it's going to be a wondering I have as we move into next week's lesson. And maybe you all read it with this, try on this lens and see if it works for you. I'm thinking that after Joseph was, cried for his half brothers, cried for his brother, I think that what happens next is more to do with getting Jacob to Egypt and to bring about some resolution there. Because the brothers, in my estimation at this point, they've shown that they're good for it. I mean, they've made 2 trips to Egypt. They didn't leave Simeon hanging. And we'll see in the next chapter that when it comes to when Benjamin's life seems to be on the line, or at least the threat is that Benjamin will need to stay in Egypt. They go out to bat Judah goes out to bat in a big way for not only Benjamin, but their father, who seems to have generated all of these unhealthy dynamics in the first place. So I'm thinking, and again, you'll have to let me know next week what you think, but I'm thinking that from this point forward, the test might have Jacob in the crosshairs more than the brothers, although they continue to have to bear the brunt of it.
Well, they never really ever get over their guilt, because when we get to the end and Israel dies, Jacob dies, they wonder now if Joseph will come after him. So the brothers never really get over the guilt. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah. And I can't wait to get to that story where Israel is giving a blessing to his grandchildren, and it seems that he never really quite learned the lessons either. Even then, I don't want to give away too much.
I do think it's very significant that the servant that speaks to the brothers and says it's all well, and he says, "You're God." And I think that probably Joseph has been doing some evangelism and sharing the Lord that he knows with them, because why else would he use this phrase?
He does seem to adopt the same religious language and assumptions that Jacob's children share.
And if I'm remembering right, when he tells about the dreams and what they mean, he says, "I'm not telling it, it's God that's telling him." So he's introducing to the Egyptian the Hebrews God. And I'm sure that because of the truthfulness and everything that happened, that it was evident that he spoke up for God and shared him with them.
Well, one of the things that's been a constant theme in Genesis, it's been pointed out in earlier chapters, whether we're talking about the king Abimelech or talking about Abraham's forays into Egypt, or whether we're talking about this strange king Melchizedek, is that in Genesis, unlike books that will come later, it seems like all of the neighboring tribes have a shared cosmology, and they seem to be talking the same God language at this point. Now, we're about to make a quick turn in Exodus when it's very clear in the time of Moses that there's a
golden calf.
yeah, well, there's that, but there's also the pantheon of Egyptian gods are assumed, and the various priests and magicians that Ramses II consults, and but at this stage that there's a lot of Genesis is often held up as a book that shows that in these biblical stories, you don't always have to read tribal gods and tribalism centered around religious life as something you assume when you come into these stories.
Was Pharaoh equated with a god at this point in Egyptian life?
I mean, by the time this story is being told for certain, yes, because man, the Egyptian Empire goes back, it's 4,000 years. It was 3,000 years in empire under various iterations.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that gave it a sense of continuity was its art and religious life.
Yeah.
But you can look at Egyptian art from 1500 BCE or 500 Common Era, and you can tell it's Egyptian. 2,000 years span. Their pantheon of gods was pretty well set. I'd have to look at it, but as far back as as far back as they began to write in hieroglyphs, I feel like they were already assuming that. I don't know how far back that goes.
So that steward might have understood that those brothers never would have seen Pharaoh as God, but they would have had a tradition that spoke to whatever their God was. I mean, that your God wasn't. I don't know. I'm not. I don't have that thought entirely formed, but.
First Pharaoh, I'm going to type in, because now I'm curious.
But it seems that the prejudice never left, even though Joseph had a high position, it sounds as though that prejudice was always still an undercurrent, because then by the time you start Exodus, the Hebrews were all slaves and making bricks and so
But it did take 400 years to go from being the shepherds in the land of Goshen to being slaves.
Yeah.
When was that turnaround?
It says in the opening lines of Exodus that there came a Pharaoh that did not remember Joseph.
Yeah.
Mm.
And that was the big. It says a new king came to power in Egypt who didn't know Joseph. He said to his people, "The Israelites are now larger in number and stronger than we are. Come." So there's this idea that they were threatening.
What did you find out about the first Pharaoh?
The first Pharaoh is thought to be, at least in Egypt storytelling, named Menses, but I couldn't find a Pharaoh. I couldn't find all it says is, I typed in first Pharaoh, thought to be a god, and it just read, I should have kept it up. The story of ancient Egypt begins from when the north and south were united as one country under the first Pharaoh, Menes. The ancient Egyptians believed that their Pharaoh was the god Horus, son of Re, the sun god. It's one of those situations where you don't know if they backread into their history, this idea that this king was God. But the first written accounts of this time, centuries after the fact, it's assumed that the Pharaoh is God.
And they had a sun god as well. I mean, before that.
Right.
So
There was one pharaoh who was seen as a heretic pharaoh who they did not like at all, who changed his name to Akhenaten, which Akht is son, and he believed he was monotheist. He insisted that the pantheon was completely wrong, and he moved the capital city out to a new city that he founded to worship this one sun deity, and he forbade the cults of the other gods. And boy, they couldn't put him behind them as fast. They could when he thought he was killed. There are stylists where his name was scrubbed out and put new ones in, and they tried their best to expunge him from the historical record because that was seen as a real travesty in the history of ancient Egypt. He was like the grandfather of Tutankhamun, King Tut, I believe. I believe who was. So you got me on these. These are the things I love. I love Egypt stuff.
We should all work on the dance.
Now I'm going to be singing that song, Sue.
Pharaoh.
Walk like an Egyptian.
Yeah.
Akhenaten. Yeah, he was known. His original name was Imhotep IV, but he changed his name to Akhenaten in honor of the sun god. And his child was Tutankhamun, who was really not an important historical figure, but he's been made famous by the beauty of his sarcophagus, that golden sarcophagus. So, well, there you have it.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, I'll go ahead and close. Thank you. This was I never know what kind of discussion these stories will generate, and I often am impressed at what you notice that I just don't even think twice about. Different minds, different eyes coming to these things is important, I think, which is a large part why we do this together. So thank you very much, all of you. And I'll see you next week, Genesis 44, and then the first 15 verses of 45. God bless.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.